The resuscitation bay of the hospital's trauma center operated on a rhythm entirely detached from the rising and setting of the sun. Deep within the windowless, brightly lit corridors, the air was a constant, sterile hum, recycled, crisp, and carrying the faint metallic scent of antiseptic and rubbing alcohol. It was exactly 6:47 on a Tuesday evening, and Savannah "Savvy" Miller was in the thick of it. Her stethoscope felt heavy against her neck, and her scrub top bore the faint, damp wrinkles of a long, exhausting shift. She had just spent the last 4 hours leading her team through a grueling, mass casualty event following a multi-car pileup on the interstate, her mind operating with the meticulous, cold precision of a grandmaster calculating a 20-move sequence on a chessboard. Her world was one of rapid, triage, chaotic sirens, and life-or-death stakes where a single miscalculation could cost a patient everything. She was entirely at home in this high-pressure complexity. Then, her personal phone buzzed against the stainless steel counter of the nurse's station. She picked it up, expecting a routine laboratory update or a call from another department. Instead, the screen illuminated with a text message from her father, Arthur Miller. The text was clinical, brief, and completely devoid of warmth. Lauren's engagement party at the Whitmore Country Club has a strict guest cap. I've reallocated your seat to an important business associate. Since you're always busy with hospital work, stay on shift. No need to request time off. Savannah read the 2 sentences once, then twice. By the 3rd time, the words seemed to burn themselves into her mind. There was no apology. No, "I'm sorry, honey." No attempt to soften the blow. It was a cold, transactional notification, discarding her from a major family milestone as if she were nothing more than a clerical error on a seating chart. A heavy, absolute quiet settled deep within her chest. It was a defense mechanism she had perfected over 20 years of medical service, the ability to compartmentalize emotional shrapnel, so she could focus on the patients who needed her. But underneath the professional exterior, the sting of being the invisible child cut as deeply as it had when she was a teenager. She leaned against the counter, the ambient noise of cardiac monitors and distant pages fading into the background as a flood of memories rushed to fill the quiet. This text message wasn't an isolated incident. It was merely the loudest, most explicit iteration of a pattern that had defined her entire relationship with her family. For 2 decades, Savannah had been treated as a ghost in her own lineage. While her younger sister Lauren's life was mapped out in vibrant, celebratory strokes, her high-end real estate closings in Charlotte, her Sweet 16, her college acceptance, Savannah's milestones were met with an exhausting, systemic silence. She remembered standing on the stage at her university graduation, receiving her nursing degree at the top of her class. She had stood there entirely alone, watching her fellow graduates collapse into the tearful, proud embraces of their parents. Arthur hadn't come. He had called 2 days prior, his voice carrying that familiar, weary finality, explaining that the drive from Virginia was simply too long, that the weekend conflicted with one of Lauren's regional cheerleading competitions, and that surely Savannah understood because the hospital will still be there next year, but Lauren's moment won't. She had told herself then, at 22, that it didn't matter. She told herself the same thing years later, when she was promoted to ER director, managing an entire floor of critical care professionals with only her hospital mentor present to acknowledge the achievement. Back home, her promotions never registered. Her dangerous, grueling nights managing crisis wards were summarized by her father at Thanksgiving dinners as "Savvy does some basic shift work at the local clinic." Whenever she attempted to speak about the reality of her profession, Arthur would shut the conversation down with his favorite, deeply entrenched doctrine. The medical field doesn't build families, Savvy. It tears them apart. You chose that grueling schedule over a real life. He had internalized a rigid, traditional definition of success, one where a woman's worth was measured by a legible, predictable domesticity, the kind of success Lauren achieved effortlessly. Savannah's achievements dealt with a world of raw human suffering that he was too terrified to understand, so he chose to treat her as though she had failed at life entirely. For years, Savannah had operated under the painful, exhausting mindset of a victim, constantly performing, constantly working harder, secretly hoping that the next title, the next administrative promotion, or the next major hospital award would finally force her father to look at her and truly see her. But looking at the glowing screen of her phone tonight, something fundamental shifted within her psyche. The text message was a catalyst. The sheer, unvarnished cruelty of being uninvited from her sister's joy so her father could cater to a local business associate broke the spell. The familiar urge to cry, to call him, to beg for an explanation, or to ask what she had done wrong simply withered away. In its place grew a profound, cool clarity. She realized that she had spent half her life allowing her family to dictate her worth, playing the role of the neglected daughter who quietly wept in the dark while waiting for scraps of validation. She was done holding her breath. She was done letting them make her feel small. Savannah placed the phone face down on the desk. Her hands were perfectly steady. She was no longer a victim of her father's rejection. She was the director of emergency medicine, a senior executive who managed the fate of thousands of patients. It was time to start acting like the author of her own destiny. She turned to her computer terminal. Sitting in her inbox was a pending approval form from the hospital's media relations team. They had requested her final authorization to release an in-depth journalistic profile and a formal portrait to the State Medical Journal for Thursday's upcoming issue, highlighting her as the most influential healthcare executive of the year for her pioneering work in critical care restructuring. Previously, Savannah's instinct, born from decades of family-enforced modesty and strict professional discretion, would have been to downplay the feature or ask for a quieter announcement. Not tonight. With a deliberate, unhesitating click of her mouse, Savannah signed the final clearance form. She authorized the full release of the article, her portrait, and her exact corporate title: Savannah Miller, Chief Nursing Officer and Director of Emergency Services. She did not do it out of a petty desire for revenge or loud retaliation. She did it because it was the absolute, unyielding truth. She was simply allowing the reality of the life she had built to exist in the open light, stepping out from the shadow of her family's engineered silence. She picked up her personal phone one last time. Without a single tear, her heart rate perfectly steady, she typed a single, professional word in response to her father's text. Understood. She turned off her screen, adjusted her stethoscope, and walked back into the trauma bay to finish her shift. The chess piece had been moved. The wall of silence was about to crumble. And for the first time in 20 years, Savannah felt entirely free. Thursday morning arrived in Charlotte with the crisp, predictable blue skies characteristic of a North Carolina spring. At the sprawling, manicured estate of the Whitmore family, the morning ritual was an exercise in generational privilege. Constance Whitmore, the undisputed matriarch of the family, sat at the head of the sunlit breakfast patio, her fingers lightly skimming the pages of the State Medical Journal. Other families read the local sports section or scrolled through digital feeds, but the Whitmores consumed the glossy professional weekly the way old money always consumed media, as a ledger of who was rising, who was falling, and where the current of local and national influence was flowing. As Constance turned to the middle spread, a feature on the inner workings of the state's healthcare infrastructure caught her eye. It was an authorized profile on the strategic minds behind a highly successful, sweeping restructuring of the regional emergency services network. Her gaze drifted to the official portrait accompanying the article. There, standing with an unmistakable aura of quiet authority in an executive office, was a woman whose eyes carried the unshakable weight of someone who commanded rooms. Constance adjusted her reading glasses, her eyes dropping to the caption printed in small, elegant type beneath the image. Savannah Miller, Chief Nursing Officer and Director of Emergency Services. The name struck a chord, vibrating against a half-forgotten piece of information. She recalled her son Bradford's fiancée, Lauren, mentioning an older sister who did some basic shift work at a local clinic. The discrepancy was immediate, glaring, and deeply suspicious to a woman like Constance, who viewed omissions as a form of social currency manipulation. Within 20 minutes, Constance had her assistant clip the article, place it inside a heavy cream envelope, and courier it directly to Arthur Miller's modest insurance office in Virginia. Attached was a brief, handwritten note typed with devastating Southern politeness. Arthur, I stumbled upon this in my morning reading. A chief nursing officer of the University Hospital Network is quite a magnificent secret to keep from us. We are left wondering why such an illustrious daughter was completely left off the guest list for our children's celebration. Is there an instability within the family we should be made aware of before the nuptials? When the courier delivered the envelope to Arthur, the old man was sitting behind his desk, reviewing routine commercial policies. He opened the letter, his eyes tracking from Constance's sharp, elegant script to the glossy journal clipping. The effect was visceral. Arthur went completely still, the air leaving his lungs in a sudden, sharp gasp. He stared at the photograph for what felt like hours, his mind violently rejecting the visual data before him. The woman in the center of the frame, shoulders back, spine perfectly straight, commanding absolute professional respect, was his daughter. The invisible daughter he had dismissed as a bureaucratic nobody working minor hospital shifts. The daughter whose graduation he had skipped because a cheerleading competition seemed more consequential. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded his chest. His lifelong assumption of her mediocrity, the safe, small narrative he had constructed to keep his own anxieties at bay, crumbled to ash on his desk. He picked up his desk phone, his hands shaking as he dialed Lauren, his voice cracking with an unfamiliar, desperate urgency. 3 states away, Lauren was pacing the polished hardwood floor of her Charlotte townhouse, the rhythm of her footsteps perfectly reflecting the chaotic spiral in her mind. Her phone had been ringing incessantly for an hour, but when her sister's name finally flashed on the screen, she answered with a voice that cracked on the very first syllable. "How could you do this to us, Savannah?" Lauren cried, her breath hitching as she walked back and forth along the hallway. "Do what, Lauren?" Savannah's voice came through the line, perfectly level, carrying the chilling, unbothered cadence of a seasoned executive. "I haven't done anything. I told Dad I understood the seating arrangement, and I stayed at the hospital. That is the end of it. Don't act like you don't know." Lauren shouted, her hand gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. "The Whitmores found out about you. Constance sent Dad the journal article. They think we've been lying to them. Savannah, they think we're hiding a family rift or some dark secret, because we didn't even invite a top healthcare director to our own family wedding. Constance is already talking to Bradford about postponing the announcement." Lauren stopped pacing, waiting for the familiar sound of her sister's apologies, the gentle, accommodating retreat she had grown accustomed to since childhood. But the silence that followed was different. It was heavy, tactical, and entirely unyielding. "I did not submit that photograph to sabotage you, Lauren," Savannah said, her tone cutting through the panic like a scalpel. "I do not control the publication schedule of the medical journal. The fact that the reality of my life embarrasses Dad's narrative is a problem he created, not me. For 20 years, you all treated my career as a non-event because it didn't fit into the small, comfortable bubble Dad built for you. You wanted me to be invisible, And now you're furious that the world refuses to pretend I don't exist. Dad thinks you planned this. Lauren cried out, her voice dropping into a desperate whisper. He thinks you strategically timed the media drop to punish him for the guest list. He's coming apart at the seams. Savannah. He keeps asking what else you're hiding. And I don't know what to say because I don't know who you are either. None of us do. Nobody ever asked. Savannah replied softly, the truth hanging between them like a physical barrier. She didn't wait for Lauren's response. She didn't offer to fix it, to call Constance, or to smooth over the jagged edges of her father's fractured pride. With a quiet, definitive click, Savannah ended the call. Back in Virginia, Arthur Miller sat alone in the dimming light of his office, the journal clipping still clutched in his hand. The power dynamic that had governed his family for 2 decades had just flipped entirely on its axis. The daughter he had spent 20 years pushing into the shadows had suddenly become the only person who held the power to save his family's reputation, leaving him stranded in the terrifying reality of his own ignorance. The transition from a silent harborer of family neglect to the absolute architect of her own life did not happen in a sudden burst of dramatic emotion. For Savannah, it was an exercise in strategic replanning. In the weeks following the journal release, she consciously detached herself from the role of the perpetual victim. She enrolled in a rigorous mindfulness retreat in the Virginia hills, learning to sit with the ghosts of her childhood without letting them dictate her present peace. She restructured her personal finances, cutting the final intangible strings that tied her to her father's approval, and signed the closing papers on a high-rise apartment in Arlington. The balcony overlooked the Potomac River, offering a vast, unobstructed view of the Washington skyline, a physical testament to the expansive life she had earned. Finally, she bypassed her standard wardrobe and commissioned a bespoke, floor-length silk gown in a soft, commanding shade of pale blue. It was elegant, structural, and entirely devoid of the submissive modesty her family had spent decades enforcing. Arthur's absolute worldview had shattered, and the fractures were rapidly widening. Desperate to salvage the crumbling engagement negotiations with the hyper-reputation-sensitive Whitmore family, he finally swallowed his decades of patriarchal pride and called his eldest daughter. He did not call to scold or demand. He called to plead. Understanding that a boundary needed to be set, Savannah refused to hold a messy, emotional conversation over the phone. Instead, she chose to bring him into her world on her own terms. She officially submitted his name into the hospital's administrative database, authorizing a temporary executive visitor clearance for the corporate wings of the medical center. On Friday afternoon, Arthur Miller arrived at the glass-fronted entrance of the University Hospital Executive Towers. He wore his finest navy church blazer, the one with the slightly outdated lapels, his hair combed with the rigid neatness of an old-school businessman. He expected a routine clinic lobby, a simple reception desk, and a quick, manageable conversation. Instead, the reality of Savannah's daily existence hit him with the force of a physical blow. Because he was accessing the high-security administrative sector of the chief executives, Arthur was not permitted to simply stroll inside. He was met by 2 uniformed security officers who treated his arrival not with casual politeness, but with absolute administrative scrutiny. For 40 minutes, Arthur stood confined within the high-security screening lounge. He watched as his identification was digitally scanned, his commercial records cross-referenced, and his visitor pass verified. The administrative detail made 2 separate internal calls to the top floor to confirm that the chief nursing officer had indeed authorized this specific civilian presence. Standing there, surrounded by keycard-locked glass doors, digital security checkpoints, and the quiet, intense machinery of a multi-million-dollar healthcare network, Arthur felt his lifelong confidence erode by the minute. The narrative that his daughter was just a minor shift worker executing mundane tasks vanished entirely. replaced by a dawning, terrifying comprehension of her actual magnitude. Once his security clearance was validated, an administrative escort led Arthur through the heavy, reinforced glass doors and up the private elevator into the executive suite. The air here was cool, carrying an intense, purposeful silence. Savannah did not rush out to meet him. She waited at the end of the main boardroom corridor, standing near a set of frosted glass double doors. She was the absolute picture of healthcare authority, her posture flawless, her executive attire immaculate. As Arthur walked toward her, his footsteps echoing softly on the polished hardwood, the environment around them began to speak for itself. Before Arthur could even open his mouth to speak, the boardroom doors opened. A renowned chief of surgery stepped out, deep in conversation with a senior director of the state medical board. As they passed Savannah, both medical authorities stopped mid-stride, inclining their heads in deep, instinctive professional respect. "Good afternoon, Director Miller," the chief of surgery said, his voice carrying the deep, unvarnished respect reserved for an absolute leader in the hospital hierarchy. "We'll need your final budget sign-off on the new trauma wing expansion before the board session tomorrow morning. You'll have the executed documents on your desk before I leave tonight, Doctor," Savannah replied smoothly. Arthur stood paralyzed, his arms hanging awkwardly at his sides, his eyes tracking the prominent physician's departure down the hallway. The flat, closing argument cadence he had used for 20 years to dismiss her profession evaporated from his throat. His gaze drifted from her face to the sleek silver nameplate on the executive door, and finally to the sheer gravity of the institution they stood within. "I didn't know," Arthur stammered, his voice losing its lifetime of certainty, sounding fragile against the quiet elegance of the executive floor. "Savannah, I had absolutely no idea any of this was real." Savannah did not soften her stance. She did not cross her arms or raise her voice. She simply leaned against the heavy desk behind her, looking down at her father with the calm, analytical evaluation of an executive reviewing a flawed corporate map. "You didn't know because you were completely comforted by your own assumptions, Dad," Savannah said, her voice steady, carrying no malice, only the weight of an undeniable fact. "You never asked. For 20 years, it was easier for you to believe I was small than to face the reality of a world you couldn't control or understand. You hid from my career because it didn't fit into the safe domestic script you wrote for this family." Arthur looked down at his shoes, the absolute weight of his failure as a father settling heavily onto his shoulders. The silence in the corridor was absolute, broken and visibly diminished by the reality of his own ignorance. He finally looked up, his eyes wide with a desperate, unspoken plea. "The Whitmores, they are questioning everything. Savannah," he whispered, his hands trembling slightly, "they think we are fractured. Lauren is devastated. I am begging you, please come to the engagement party tomorrow night." Savannah looked at him for a long moment, letting the request hang in the cool air. She didn't grant him immediate absolution, nor did she throw his past cruelties in his face. "I will be there," Savannah said calmly, her tone suggesting a strategic decision rather than a family obligation. "But I am going for Lauren, not for your narrative." She turned and escorted him back toward the secure elevator bank, leaving Arthur to walk out into the afternoon sun entirely overwhelmed, fully aware that the daughter he had spent a lifetime pushing into the dark was now the only light capable of saving his family's future. The Whitmore estate on a Saturday evening was a breathtaking masterclass in Southern aristocracy, designed to overwhelm the senses long before a single word was exchanged. Nestled on the affluent, heavily wooded outskirts of Charlotte, the historic Georgian manor house stood framed by ancient weeping willows that draped like velvet curtains against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. The grand stone terrace, paved in smooth, cold travertine that caught the moonlight, was illuminated by the warm, amber glow of custom wrought iron lanterns. The air carried a complex, intoxicating blend of fragrances. The rich, heavy scent of blooming white gardenias, the damp earth from the meticulously manicured lawns, and the crisp, effervescent sting of expensive champagne bubbling in crystal flutes. A string quartet stationed near the rose garden played a subdued, classical arrangement. The sharp, melancholy pull of the cellos and the airy vibrato of the violins mingled effortlessly with the polite, practiced chatter of North Carolina's elite. Yet, beneath this pristine veneer of opulence, the atmosphere was thick with a suffocating, silent tension. The Whitmore family was on the precipice of a quiet, calculated retreat. Constance Whitmore, the undisputed matriarch of the family, stood near the intricately carved marble balustrade. She was wrapped in the faint, sharp aroma of French perfume and expensive silk, her posture icy and unyielding as she whispered to her husband. Her eyes, cold and assessing, swept over the crowd with a clear, sharp judgment. Her absolute dissatisfaction with the Miller family's perceived lack of transparency radiated from her every movement, a rigid barrier that chilled the air around her. A few yards away stood Lauren, trapped in a delicate cream-colored lace dress that seemed to swallow her whole. Her face was entirely drained of color, her skin looking almost translucent under the amber lanterns. Her fingers nervously picked at the fabric of her skirt as she forced a stiff, hollow smile, desperately trying to project a joy she did not feel while enduring the calculated, distant glances and muffled whispers of her future in-laws, who looked at her as if she were a liability. Arthur Miller stood at the periphery of the terrace, the heavy weight of the evening pressing visibly onto his older shoulders. He held a crystal tumbler of single malt bourbon, the amber liquid sloshing against the ice cubes with a sharp, metallic clink as his hand trembled. He hadn't touched a single drop. The rich, smoky scent of the alcohol only made his stomach churn with a sickening anxiety. His eyes darted nervously toward the Grand Oak entrance every few seconds, his chest heaving slightly under his stiff blazer. He knew, with absolute certainty, that his family's social survival and the very future he had envisioned for Lauren hung by a single, fragile thread. Then the heavy, iron-strapped oak doors swung open with a deep, resonant groan, and Savannah entered the terrace. She did not wear the starch-stiff lab coat or the functional, utilitarian scrubs of the emergency department. Instead, she stepped into the light, wearing the bespoke, floor-length silk gown in pale blue. The fabric was a triumph of structural elegance, clean, razor-sharp lines that fell with a heavy, liquid grace, catching the ambient lantern light like a sheet of calm glacial ice. The gown exuded a quiet, commanding presence, entirely devoid of the submissive, apologetic modesty her family had spent decades enforcing upon her. She carried no corporate badges, no stethoscopes, and no overt professional accessories, yet the sheer, unshakable authority she had cultivated over 20 years of managing high-stakes healthcare crises and staring down death in the trauma bay preceded her like a physical force. She did not look like a woman trying to fit into an elite, exclusive crowd. She walked with the absolute, rooted certainty of a leader who operated entirely above it. As Savannah's heels clicked sharply against the travertine stone, a rhythmic, deliberate sound that cut through the soft murmur of the party. The ambient chatter on the terrace experienced a sudden, dramatic dip in volume. Heads turned instinctively, drawn by the invisible gravity of her presence. The sheer power of her bearing demanded immediate attention, shifting the air pressure in the room before she even spoke a word. Savannah navigated the crowded terrace with a cool, measured grace, her expression perfectly composed, a mask of serene professionalism shielding her thoughts. She walked steadily toward her sister, intending only to offer her presence as a protective shield against the Whitmore's freezing condescension. But before she could close the distance to Lauren, a sudden, sharp stir rippled through the most exclusive circle of guests gathered near the mahogany bar. Dr. Marcus Vance, a legendary and highly distinguished retired medical authority, a man whose word carried absolute weight in the state's highest political and economic circles, stopped mid-sentence. His glass of scotch remained frozen in his hand as his eyes locked onto Savannah. Without a single second of hesitation, the towering, silver-haired healthcare leader stepped completely away from the city's top political donors, brushed past the elite investors, and walked directly toward her. As he closed the distance, the prominent physician did not offer a casual, social wave. Instead, he straightened his spine and extended his hand in a gesture of profound, unvarnished professional respect. A formal acknowledgement so stark and significant that it stunned the surrounding onlookers into an absolute breathless silence. The string quartet seemed to fade into a distant hum as the entire terrace watched the interaction. Director Miller, Dr. Marcus Vance announced, his clear, resonant voice carrying effortlessly across the stone terrace, cutting through the heavy scent of gardenias and the clinking of glasses. I had no idea we would be graced with your presence tonight. It is an absolute, undeniable honor to stand in the same room as you again. Savannah accepted the greeting, her fingers closing around his with a firm, confident grip, a polite, diplomatic smile softening the sharp, analytical lines of her features. The honor is entirely mine, Doctor. I didn't realize you were connected to the Whitmore family. Old friends and old investments, the doctor replied, his deep voice rich with genuine admiration, before he turned his gaze directly toward a stunned Constance Whitmore and a trembling Arthur, who had quickly drifted closer, drawn like moths to the sudden, blinding spectacle. Dr. Marcus Vance smiled, though his eyes remained razor-sharp as he looked at the hosts. Constance, Arthur, I certainly hope you appreciate the extraordinary caliber of the woman standing before you tonight. Last year, when the Whitmore Corporation's primary overseas healthcare funding project and their multi-million-dollar clinical expansion initiative were on the absolute verge of total operational shutdown due to the international regulatory crisis, it was Director Miller's brilliant strategic restructure and decisive policy redirection that quietly, flawlessly resolved the threat. She didn't just save 11 of our finest community expansion initiatives from total collapse that night. She single-handedly secured the economic, legal, and structural salvation of your family's entire international healthcare holdings. The revelation landed on the stone terrace with the crushing weight of a collapsing monument, shattering the fragile glass of the Whitmore's elitism. The social hierarchy of the entire evening flipped instantly, violently, and irreversibly on its axis. Constance Whitmore's carefully cultivated condescension vanished in a single breath. Her jaw tightened, a sudden, visible flush of heat creeping up her neck as her face morphed into a mixture of absolute shock and immediate, calculated reverence. The cold perfume around her seemed to evaporate as she stepped forward, her voice suddenly stripped of its icy, dismissive edge, replaced by an eager, almost sycophantic warmth that coated her words like honey. Director Miller, Savannah, my goodness, we had absolutely no idea. Please, you must forgive our lack of proper protocol and hostly accommodations tonight. Bradford, Lauren, darling, why on earth didn't you tell us your sister was an absolute savior to our family's foundation? Lauren stood, completely frozen, her mouth slightly open, her eyes wide and luminous as she looked from the legendary doctor to Savannah. The staggering reality of her sister's immense world, a universe of structural power, massive financial impact, and deep professional reverence, finally penetrated her own sheltered, real estate bubble, leaving her utterly breathless. Arthur watched the scene unfold from the dark edge of the circle, the ice in his untouched bourbon melting away to nothing. His pride, built over 2 decades of deliberate blindness and quiet dismissals, was entirely, ruthlessly crushed under the sheer magnitude of the truth. The eldest daughter, he had uninvited via a clinical two-line text message the daughter he had spent a lifetime treating as a minor, embarrassing shift worker who merely cleaned up after others, was the very reason the wealthy, arrogant Whitmore family even had a healthcare empire left to boast about tonight. Savannah did not gloat. She did not look at her father with an expression of petty triumph, nor did she acknowledge Constance's sudden, desperate flattery with anything more than a polite, perfectly measured diplomatic nod. She stood at the absolute center of the elite gathering, the cool evening breeze catching the edges of her pale blue silk gown, completely detached from their shallow validation. She held the ultimate, unyielding leverage over the very people who had spent a lifetime trying to make her feel invisible. And she did so without firing a single shot. The emotional aftershocks of the engagement party did not dissipate overnight. They lingered in the morning air, heavy and unresolved, like the thick fog rolling off the hills. The following afternoon, a tense, suffocating silence filled Savannah's rental car as she drove alongside Lauren toward their childhood home in Roanoke, Virginia. The only sounds were the rhythmic, metallic click of the turn signal and the low, continuous hum of the tires against the asphalt. Arthur followed closely behind in his own vehicle, a solitary figure visible in the rearview mirror, the rigid distance between the two cars perfectly mimicking the vast emotional space that had separated them for over 2 decades. When they finally pulled into the driveway, the familiar 2-story suburban house looked exactly as it always had, yet the atmosphere inside felt profoundly altered. The old, comfortable illusions had been stripped away, leaving only the raw, uncomfortable chill of truth settling into the quiet rooms. Without a word, Arthur bypassed the warmth of the living room and led his daughters down the narrow, dimly lit hallway to the back bedroom. The floorboards creaked under their weight, a sharp, echoing sound in the quiet house. He knelt before the hall closet, a dark, cramped space that had been strictly off-limits during their childhood, rumored to hold nothing more than old tax documents and dust-covered seasonal decorations. With a visible strain in his shoulders and a low, heavy grunt, Arthur pulled out a large, gray plastic storage bin and set it heavily onto the center of the faded mattress. The dull thud of the plastic hitting the bed resonated through the room, kicking up a faint cloud of dust that danced in the single beam of sunlight cutting through the blinds. "What is this, Dad?" Lauren asked, her voice quiet, almost a whisper, her hand hovering in uncertainty over the container, her fingers trembling slightly. "Read the front of the top envelope," Arthur said. His voice had lost every ounce of its lifetime polish, sounding rough, gravelly, and entirely undisciplined, stripped of the flat, closing argument cadence he had used for 20 years. Savannah stepped closer, the scent of aged paper and cedar wood hitting her senses as she looked down at the container. Resting at the very top was a thick envelope postmarked from the university nursing registry 24 years ago. The handwriting staring back at her was unmistakably her own, the neat, disciplined script of her younger self, written with a fountain pen she had long since lost. Beneath it lay dozens of similar envelopes, stacked in neat, heavy piles, loosely bound by year, spanning the entire duration of her healthcare career. There were tear-stained letters sent from the chaotic, fluorescent-lit break rooms of her first grueling residency, frayed, creased notes from her years managing underfunded public health clinics, and formal, heavy envelopes marking every quiet executive promotion she had ever achieved. She had sent them faithfully into the void, year after year, treating the silence as a tactical reality, never truly expecting an answer. She had stopped counting how many she had mailed somewhere around year 12. "You never opened them," Savannah said, her tone completely level, flat, and devoid of accusation. The pristine, unbroken wax seals and yellowed, untouched adhesive flaps spoke for themselves with a crushing finality. Arthur sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, the mattress groaning under his weight, his weathered hands resting flat on the sides of the storage bin as if it were an anchor keeping him from collapsing entirely. He looked small, his broad shoulders hunched forward. "I opened the first few," he admitted, his eyes fixed on the worn pattern of the carpet, refusing to meet Savannah's gaze. "Early on, when you first started your residency, I broke the seal on 2 of them, and I didn't know what to do with what I read. You sounded so sure of yourself, savvy, so capable, describing intense, heartbreaking medical crises I couldn't picture, decisions I knew I wouldn't have had the stomach to make in your position." He paused, his jaw working as a sudden, violent tremor passed through his frame. For the first time in 46 years, Savannah watched her father weep. It was a controlled, quiet collapse, the cracking open of a deeply repressed, generational trauma that had hardened within him like stone. The tears silently tracked down the deep wrinkles of his face, catching the pale sunlight. "My own father, your grandfather, died suddenly in a hospital bed due to a massive, negligent medical error when I was just a boy," Arthur confessed, his voice breaking completely, a raw, strangled sound. "It ruined our family, and I grew up terrified of hospitals and the entire medical world. To me, it only meant helplessness, suffering, and cold, unavoidable loss. When you chose that life, I froze. Every time a new letter arrived with the hospital logo stamped on the corner, my stomach twisted into knots. I was too cowardly to face the reality that you were dealing with life and death crises every day, and that I had absolutely no power to protect you from that world. I hid the letters away because I was terrified that if I opened the next one, it would contain news of a tragedy. I forced myself to believe you were just a safe, small clerk doing irrelevant paperwork because that was the only narrative my fear would allow me to survive. I hid from your greatness because I was too weak to handle the reality of your world." Lauren was crying openly now, a soft, muffled sobbing. She pressed one of the yellowed envelopes against her chest as she sat on the carpet, her fingers tracing the old ink. The room was suffocatingly quiet, the heavy weight of 20 years of engineered neglect finally explained, not as hatred or malice, but as a profound, paralyzing generational fear. "May I read one?" Savannah asked softly. Now, out loud. Arthur managed a weak, painful nod, unable to speak, his hands covering his face. Savannah reached into the bin, the crisp rustle of old paper filling the silence, and selected a soft, worn envelope from her early years at the university clinic. Her own voice caught slightly as she unfolded the aged paper, the sharp scent of old ink rising from the page, reading the words of a younger, more vulnerable version of herself. "Dear Dad, I know you don't understand why I chose this path. I know it isn't the safe, traditional life you pictured for me. But I need you to know that I'm not running away from this family. I'm running toward the woman I know I am capable of becoming, even if it takes a long time to get there, and even if it takes you longer to understand it. I don't need your applause right now. I just hope that someday you'll have the curiosity to want to know who your daughter actually is. Love, Savannah." When the last sentence faded into the room, the silence was absolute, heavy and thick. Arthur buried his face in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking violently as he wept. It was the ultimate, unvarnished undoing of the family patriarch. "I'm so sorry, Savvy." He wept into his hands, the words muffled and broken. "For the text message, for the missed graduations, for the 20 years of getting it completely wrong. I don't know how to undo 2 decades of cowardice, but I want to try, if you'll let me." Savannah did not offer a tidy, immediate, cinematic absolution. She did not tell him it was fine, because it wasn't, and her days of sacrificing her own truth for his comfort were permanently over. But she did not walk away either. She sat down quietly beside Lauren on the edge of the bed, allowing the long-buried truth to exist between them, unhurried, heavy, and unresolved. Before she left the house that evening, the air cooling as night fell, Arthur walked into the living room carrying a heavy iron hammer, a sharp nail, and a framed photograph he had retrieved from the very bottom of the gray bin. A portrait of Savannah at 22, proudly holding her top-of-the-class nursing degree, her eyes bright with a determination he had spent a lifetime ignoring. With steady, deliberate movements, the sharp, metallic echo of the hammer striking the nail, ringing through the house 3 times. He drove the nail into the center of the living room wall. He hung the portrait directly beside the massive, formal portrait of Lauren, the spot that Lauren had occupied alone for a decade. He stepped back, his boots scuffing the floor, looking at the 2 sisters hung as absolute, unyielding equals. "There," Arthur said, his voice still unsteady, his breath catching in his throat. "It's 20 years late, but there." 2 weeks later, the Washington, D.C. spring had turned pleasantly warm, the air carrying the sweet, fresh scent of blooming cherry blossoms. Savannah stood on the balcony of her new Arlington high-rise, the cool ceramic of a steaming mug of black coffee cradled securely between her palms. The rich, roasted aroma of the coffee drifted up, mixing with the gentle breeze. It was the golden hour, that precise, amber slice of evening when the setting sun washed over the Virginia hills, painting the entire sky in brilliant strokes of crimson and gold, turning the vast waters of the Potomac River into a shimmering sheet of liquid copper. She looked out over the sprawling, magnificent expanse of the Capitol, her executive clinical blazer hanging neatly in the closet behind her, its fabric smooth and immaculate. She had agreed to her father's soft, almost shy request to wear her formal director's white blouse and hospital honors to Lauren's wedding in the spring. He hadn't asked her to wear it to show off to the Whitmores or to secure another corporate contract. He had asked simply because he wanted to finally look at his eldest daughter clearly, without the suffocating filter of his old fears. Savannah took a slow, deliberate sip of her coffee, the liquid warm and comforting against the cool evening air, and smiled as a profound, unshakable sense of peace settled deep into her bones. She realized then that the immense strength that had carried her through chaotic, blood-slicked emergency wards and high-stakes healthcare boardrooms had not been diminished by opening that long-closed door to her family. It had been entirely liberated. She no longer carried the burning, heavy anger of the neglected child, nor did she require a perfect, flawless apology to feel whole. She had rescued herself, standing high above the river, bathed in the warm, golden light of a future she had entirely authored. Savannah stood free, proud, and completely at peace with the horizon ahead. All shadows must fade before the truth, and every pain is simply the start of a beautiful rebirth. Always remember, the right to write a new chapter of your life is forever in your hands. Please like, share, and subscribe if this story resonated with you. Hope to see you on the next page.